Week 4 of the fantasy football season. His quarterback starts sit every matchup this week, Thursday night. Seattle Seahawks at the Arizona Cardinals. Sam Darnold, I thought he's played well the first 2 out of 3 games this season here for this Seattle Seahawks team. And with guys like Jackson Smith and Najigba in that offense, Cooper Kupp still shows some flashes here and there in a good backfield of Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet. And this week, a division matchup at the Cardinals that got a middle-of-the-pack defense. I think Sam Darnold is a fringe option. Last season, we saw he had the big year with the Minnesota Vikings, and so far we've seen some flashes of that with 2 decent games in the last 2 weeks at Pittsburgh in week 2, and then last week an easy victory versus the Saints 44-13. Kyler Murray a start. Kyler Murray, he's been putting up points this season, and we know with his rushing ability there's upside, because if he gives you 4 or 5 extra points a week running the football, and let's say it grows for another 150 to 200 yards in the touchdown, the numbers are going to be there. So this Seattle Seahawks defense, no doubt about it, is an improved unit this season. We know him and Marvin Harrison haven't been on the same page, but when you got a tight end like Trey McBride, and with his rushing ability, I think it's enough for him to be a weekly starter in 12-team leagues or deeper. Minnesota Vikings at the Steelers in Dublin, Ireland, this game, overseas ball game. Carson Wentz to sit last week was a good start for Carson Wentz, but it was easy when you're up 3 touchdowns before you really get into the offense and get things going. So this week in a tough matchup versus the Steelers, Carson Wentz is a sit. Aaron Rodgers is a sit as well. We saw last week this defense go off versus Jake Brown and then the Cincinnati Bengals. And Aaron Rodgers, so far, I thought he's played decent for this Pittsburgh Steelers team, but he's more of a real-life option than a fantasy football option, where his ceiling is pretty capped. And he's got okay options in the offense, but nothing over the top that could really carry him to becoming a consistent starter week in and week out for fantasy football. Like, they got Metcalf, Jonnu Smith, Calvin Austin, decent collection of players, but no one, like I said, on that superstar level and big time that could carry him to points. New Orleans Saints at the Buffalo Bills, Spencer Rattler is hit. But the thing with Rattler, he's at least going out there competing and looking decent at times, even though I know last week was a complete joke, losing 44-13 at the Seahawks, where that game was over from the get-go. And this week at Buffalo could be another long day for Rattler in this offense. He's an easy sit. Josh Allen, obviously it took him first, second quarterback off the board in your fantasy drafts. Week 2 was a little bit of a hiccup, where it was the James Cook show, and he carried them to victory. But the first 2 out of 3 weeks, monster ball games, and this week once again versus a bad New Orleans team, he's an easy start and a top option. Tennessee Titans at the Texans, Cam Ward, there's going to be a lot of growing pains, and there's just not much on this offense. Calvin Ridley's been a bust so far this season. Tony Pollard, his numbers haven't been great, and the only bright spot's been another rookie with Cam Ward, Alec Ayomaner of this Tennessee Titan team, where he's got 2 touchdowns in the first 3 weeks. So this week it's a pack matchup, but this Texan defense I think is pretty decent. I know they're 0-3 on the year, but when you got a corner like Stingley and Anderson rushing the pass, I think that's enough. And in this game where Tennessee's offensive line isn't that good and there's not a lot of playmakers on the offense, I think it's a tough start for Ward, and this defense goes out there, has a good game. CJ Stroud is sit. His ceiling's pretty much been capped the last season, and this year is CJ Stroud. I know it's a decent matchup on paper versus the Tennessee Titans coming to town, but this Houston Texan team, they just don't have many options, and Stroud isn't spreading the football out that well. Pretty much it's been Nico Collins and Dalton Schultz a little bit in this offense, where guys making a reception or 2 per game. I know Christian Kirk came back last week, but I think his best years are behind him. An occasional pop game here and there, but not enough for Stroud to be a weekly starter as of now in fantasy football, unless he really gets back to 2023 form. Cleveland Browns at the Lions, Joe Flacco is sit. Joe Flacco at the latter part of his career, 41 years old, and this offense can't really get anything going. I know last week they beat the Green Bay Packers in one of the bigger upsets we've seen in a while in football, but this offense, I know they got decent guys, Jerry Jeudy, Cedric Tillman, David Njoku, Harold Fannis Jr., but I don't think it's enough weekly for Flacco to be a fantasy option. And obviously without the rushing upside, he's a touchdown dependable quarterback. And this week in a tough matchup at the Lions, where they gave Lamar a hard time, he's an easy sit. Jared Goff a start. We know he's been a better fantasy quarterback at home than he's been on the road. Even last week, the Lions went out there, offensive masterpiece, but Jared Goff only had 14.5 fantasy points in that game, where obviously Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery did a lot of damage on the ground. But this week, even versus a good defense of the Browns, like I said, this Lion offense, in terms of fantasy football, the points are up for everybody indoors in Detroit. Washington Commanders at the Falcons, Jaden Daniels, if he plays, obviously he's a must start. He was a top 3-4 quarterback off the board in fantasy leagues. And last week, Marcus Mariota filled in well for him. But like I said, Jaden Daniels, he had the knee sprain. Give him that rest, 2 weeks off now, and I think Daniels is going to give it a real go in this one. And obviously versus Falcon defense that lost 30-0 last week, he's an easy start. And if Mariota did start in this game, I know he's got some rushing upside, but still, this early in the season, to trust a guy like Mariota, unless you're in deep 2-quarterback leagues or whatever, he would be a fringe option. And Michael Penix Jr. I sit for this Atlanta Falcon team. Last week, he couldn't get anything going. The Carolina Panthers are one of the worst defenses in the league, and this offense was shut down and shut out 30-0. So Penix, maybe he has to go back to the drawing board, or maybe they go to Kirk Cousins. Once again, it's Atlanta sooner than later. But right now, he's not a fancy option at all. Philadelphia Eagles at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Jalen Hurts led the comeback last week versus the Los Angeles Rams. People said he couldn't throw the football, and he went out there once again as Hurts and proved people wrong. And this week in a matchup at Tampa, well, they got a leaky secondary, and he was a top 3-4 quarterback off the board as well. He's an easy start. Baker Mayfield to start as well. I know last week the numbers weren't great. I know Mike Evans, he's down now with the hamstring injury, 2 to 4 weeks with the injury. But Baker Mayfield, we know he's a gunslinger. Chris Godwin possibly could return in this game. I know it's one of the tougher matchups for him this season versus Eagle defense. But Baker Mayfield, to me, he's locked in as a start weekly. Carolina Panthers at the New England Patriots. Bryce Young, he's a sit this week. Bryce Young's definitely taken strides over the last season and a half, where last year, beginning of the year, he couldn't do anything. And then, obviously, mid-season last year and the first weeks of this season, he's gone out there and definitely improved. But he don't have a lot of options on this offense. It's pretty much Tedor McMillan and Hubbard out of the backfield. No one else really stepping up or emerging besides Renfro in that Week 2 game at Arizona. And then in Week 3, he didn't do anything versus the Falcons. A younger sit versus a decent Patriot unit. Drake May is starting this one. Drake May, he's that quarterback that this Patriot team wanted. Obviously, the last couple of years where they drafted Mac Jones, he was a bust. But now getting May, last NFL draft here, he's going out there spreading the football out. And let's be honest, there's not a lot of options in this offense. And May has made the most of it, scoring over 20 fantasy points the last couple of weeks here. So this week in a matchup versus a mediocre to poor defense of the Panthers, he's a start. Los Angeles Chargers at the Giants. Justin Herbert, he's been solid so far to begin the season. And when you got 3 talented wide receivers like Ladd McConkey, Keenan Allen, and Quentin Johnston, you're going to go out there and you're going to work your way into points. And Amarian Hampton emerged last week with a big game as well, and 60 yards out of the backfield catching. So this week in an easy matchup at a Giant defense that can't stop anyone, he's an easy start. The rookie Jackson Dart getting his first NFL career start. Russell Wilson, first 3 starts, 2 horrible games and 1 great game at the Cowboys. But the Giants 0-3, they're going nowhere this season, and they figure they throw the kid into the fire. And this week it's going to be a tough matchup for Jackson Dart versus the Los Angeles Chargers. But in terms of this offense overall, I think it helps. This kid's got a big arm. He's going to bring some energy. It's definitely going to help Malik Neighbors, I believe, and also Cam Scatterbo. It's going to help a little bit as well in the backfield, where it could definitely open this offense up a little bit and bring him energy, like I said. But a very tough matchup in his first career start versus Charger defense. Jacksonville Jaguars at the Niners. Trevor Lawrence, he'll have a decent game here and there, but this week a tougher matchup on the road, where his numbers haven't been great on the road as well, going back to last season. I know Nick Foles is out for the season with a torn ACL, but Lawrence, with his top 2 options, Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter, not getting open and making plays, he's a tough guy, obviously, to start this week. An easy sit. Brock Purdy, definitely a possibility he returns this week versus Jaguars. And if he returns, he's in the lineup. Ricky Pearsall's definitely got things going this season. Juwan Jennings last year had some big games, and this season had a good game, and then missed last week as well. So with this offense getting a little bit healthier, even though we know George Kittle's out, but as long as you got CMC in the backfield, the numbers are going to be there, where he's one of the best receiving backs in the league. And Mac Jones, if he's starting once again for this Niner team, the upside isn't there, and he's been more of a game manager the last 2 weeks, even though they won both those games. Indianapolis Colts at the Rams. Daniel Jones, this might be his toughest test to date as an Indianapolis Colt. First 3 weeks, Daniel Jones, he's going out there at least 18 or more fantasy points. And this week at the Rams, this could be a potential track meet between these 2 teams. I know the Colts don't have a lot of flashy names on offense. Pretty much it's Jones, Jonathan Taylor, Pittman, and the rookie Warren look decent so far in the early going. But this week at the Rams, they're going to have to throw a little bit more, I think. And Daniel Jones, he's been a top 5 quarterback so far in the early going. Matthew Stafford to start. Like I said, this could be a potential high-scoring game, and Stafford as well, putting up decent amount of points in the early going. When you got stud receivers like Puka Nacua and Devontae Adams, obviously that makes everything easier. And this week versus middle-of-the-pack Colt defense coming to town, I like Stafford as a start. Chicago Bears at the Vegas Raiders. Caleb Williams as a start. As a real-life quarterback, I don't think Caleb Williams is impressive, but the first 3 weeks of the season, you can't deny his fantasy numbers as Caleb Williams, especially last week torching that Dallas Cowboy team coming to Soldier Field, where he went for 4 touchdowns in that one and made it look pretty easy. So Caleb's got some rushing upside. He's got some good options around him. Rome Odunze, DJ Moore, obviously in the receiving room, and Luther Burden had a breakout game, was a rookie, and Swift out of the backfield. And this week at a defense of the Raiders that's similar to the Cowboys, they can't stop anyone. He's an easy start. Geno Smith, the fringe option. Last week, Geno put up a monster game, but it was a lot of garbage time and was a lot of Trey Tucker on just telling him, go deep, I'll throw it, and try to catch up to it and burn the secondary, and that's what happened. And this week, not a bad matchup versus Chicago Bears, but still Geno Smith I have as a fringe option. Baltimore Ravens at the Chiefs. We know these teams both had heavyweight battles over the years in the playoffs and regular season. And Lamar Jackson, easily the number one quarterback right now in fantasy football in the first 3 weeks of the season. He does it all. He's a dual threat, obviously, throwing, running the football. And it was good to see Mark Andrews get going in last week's game, 91 yards and 2 touchdowns. And this week here, even in a matchup with the Kansas City Chiefs, where their defense is pretty decent, he's a start. Patrick Mahomes a start. I know the numbers have been up and down a little bit for Patrick Mahomes, and last season they weren't that great for Mahomes, but so far this year with limited options, with Rashee Rice suspended, Travis Kelce not doing much, and Xavier Worthy banged up, even though he might return after missing the last 2 games in a matchup where the Chiefs know they got to put points on the board, and Baltimore's defense has been leaky the first 2 out of 3 weeks in the high-scoring game with Buffalo losing 41-40, and then Detroit obviously going over 30 points versus them in last week's game. Mahomes a start. Green Bay Packers at the Dallas Cowboys. Jordan Love a start for me in this game. He didn't have a great game last week versus the Browns, but anytime there's a quarterback who's anything a decency for fantasy football and you're versus the Dallas Cowboys, you put this guy in your starting lineup. I know Matthew Golden hasn't shown much. Tucker Kraft pretty much the only reliable option in that offense for the Green Bay Packers. But like I said, this is a great matchup for Love. And going back a couple years ago in a playoff game at Dallas, he had a touchdown party versus them in that blowout victory. Dak Prescott is it. Tough matchup versus Green Bay, one of the best, if not the best defenses in the league. And now he's down CeeDee Lamb, his best receiver, and one of the best receivers in the league, obviously 3 to 4 weeks with the high ankle sprain. So with those factors, even though they could be trailing and there could be garbage time in this game, I'm just going to shy away from Dak. And he's a sit. New York Jets at the Dolphins. First of 2 Monday night games. Justin Fields, if he plays, he would be a start for me. This Dolphin defense can't stop anyone. Their secondary depleted, obviously, with a lot of injuries in training camp. And Fields, with his rushing ability and upside, and a good number one receiver like Garrett Wilson, I think he would be good enough in this one in Miami. But if it's Tyrod Taylor once again, which I could see the Jets leaning towards, where they kept it open who the quarterback's going to be this week in Miami. Taylor's a sit. He don't have much upside, but he's a decent quarterback. Definitely one of the better backup quarterbacks and game manager, but not a fantasy option. Tua will be a start. Tua obviously better at home in terms of putting up fantasy numbers than he is on the road. And last week I thought Tua played a pretty good game towards the end. Obviously a bad interception that ended the game, but Tyreek Hill's been playing better. So the last 2 weeks after week 1, he did nothing. And Jalen Waddle's got 2 touchdowns so far this season, where last year he couldn't get anything going. So with that, Von Achane, one of the better receivers out of the backfield in pro football, and also a Jet secondary that can't stop anyone, giving up 30 points a game. I would start to with this week, Cincinnati Bengals and the Broncos second of the 2 Monday night games. And to close the week out, Jake Browning a sit. I know they got great options still. Jamar Chase, obviously the best receiver in the league. T. Higgins, Chase Brown in the backfield. He's been definitely a bust so far in the early going. And last week, after the turnovers and just a horrible ball game, I can't trust Browning in this matchup, especially at a Denver Bronco team. Even though I know the defense has given up a lot of points this season, they still get pressure. They still could turn the football over. And it's going to be a great matchup with Jamar Chase and one of the better corners in the league, Patrick Surtain, in this one. And now Bo Nix, I would start him. Cincinnati's defense isn't that good. They really can't stop anyone. And Bo Nix, he's been a better quarterback at home than he's been on the road. The only thing with Nix, he's getting a little too flashy with some of the throws, and it's caused some interceptions early in the season. And also as well, I want to see him run a little bit more. That's where he had good value last season, pushing for about 450 yards last year. So that's quarterback start sit every matchup for week 4 of the fantasy football season.